On the morning of August 13th, 2018, a 63-year-old man got out of bed in a quiet house in Wesley Chapel, Florida, and walked across the room to adjust the air conditioning. It was an ordinary thing to do. The kind of small, forgettable task that every one of us performs 1,000 times without ever thinking about it. He was hot, or the house was warm, and he wanted to cool it down. That was all. And somewhere between getting up and reaching that thermostat, his body betrayed him. He collapsed. He hit his head. And within moments, one of the most recognizable men in the history of professional wrestling was gone. To the millions of people who grew up watching him, he was the Anvil, the pink and black powerhouse, the cackling, manic, impossibly strong half of one of the greatest tag teams ever assembled. They literally named him after an anvil, a solid block of iron, the very symbol of indestructibility. And that is the cruel irony at the center of his story, because the man they called the Anvil, the man whose entire identity was built around being unbreakable, was not undone by his back, or his knees, or his heart. He was undone by his mind, by the one part of him that all those years of violence had been quietly chipping away at, blow by blow, collision by collision, since he was a child. By the time those final hours arrived, the strongest man many people had ever seen had been slowly disappearing from the inside out, and almost nobody on the outside understood what was really happening to him. In this video, we are going to walk through the final stretch of Jim's life, the morning everything ended, and the long, painful decline that led him there, a decline his family kept hidden from the world so that he could live out his remaining time in peace. But to understand how a man like that ends up collapsing by an air conditioner on an ordinary Monday, you have to go all the way back to the beginning, because the damage that took him did not start in a wrestling ring. It started long before he ever met the Hart family. It started when he was a boy. Jim was born James Henry on February 8, 1955, in Montebello, California. He grew up in Southern California, and from very early on it was obvious that he was not built like other kids. He was big, he was strong, and he was drawn to the kinds of activities where raw physical power was the whole point. He found football early, and he found it at a time and in a place where the dangers of the sport were almost completely misunderstood. His daughter would later say that he started playing tackle football at around 11 years old, in an era when kids simply were not protected the way they are today. The equipment was primitive. The understanding of head injuries was essentially non-existent. Nobody was tracking concussions. Nobody was pulling a kid out of a game because he got his bell rung. You shook it off and you got back in there. And so, from the age of 11, a young Jim began absorbing impacts to the head, over and over again, year after year, as a completely normal part of the game he loved. Hold on to that detail. It matters more than almost anything else in this entire story. By high school, his strength had become genuinely exceptional. At Newport Harbor High School, Jim became a standout in the throwing events in track and field, the events that reward the kind of explosive, brute power that he had in abundance. He was a shot put phenomenon. In fact, he set the California high school record in the shot put, and that record reportedly stood for more than a decade, from 1973 all the way into the mid-1980s. Think about that. In one of the most populous and athletically competitive states in the entire country, this kid threw the shot put farther than anyone before him, and nobody could beat that mark for over 10 years. That is not just being strong. That is being a generational physical specimen. That kind of talent opens doors, and for Jim, the door it opened first was the National Football League. After high school, he pursued a career in pro football, and he got real looks from real teams. He spent time with the Oakland Raiders and the Dallas Cowboys, working in practices and preseason games. He never broke through into the regular season. He never became a household name on the gridiron. But here's the part that ties back to that childhood detail. Every day at that level meant more contact, more collisions, more of those same impacts to the head that had been part of his life since he was 11. The NFL did not give Jim a long career, but it almost certainly added to a debt that would not come due for another 40 years. When the football dream ended with his release from the Cowboys, Jim had to figure out what came next. And the answer would change his entire life. He was put in contact with a man named Stu Hart, the legendary patriarch of a wrestling dynasty operating out of Calgary, In Canada, Stu Hart ran a promotion called Stampede Wrestling, and he was famous, or perhaps infamous, for a training facility in the basement of his home. They called it the Dungeon. It was a place where Stu would stretch and twist aspiring wrestlers into submission, testing whether they had the toughness and the desire to make it in a brutal business. Many men walked into that basement full of confidence and walked back out, having decided that professional wrestling was not for them. Jim was not one of those men. He went to Calgary, he trained under Stu Hart, and he stayed. He began working for Stampede Wrestling in 1978, and he quickly became part of the fabric of the place. And then something happened that would change his life forever, in a way that had nothing to do with the ring. He fell in love with one of Stu Hart's daughters. Her name was Elizabeth, though everyone called her Ellie. They married in 1979. And just like that, this kid from Southern California became a member of the most famous wrestling family in the world. He was now the brother-in-law of Bret Hart, of Owen Hart, of Keith and Ross Hart. He had married into wrestling royalty. It was during this Stampede period that Jim got the name that would define him. The story is wonderful, and it is true. Stu Hart, always looking for a way to generate publicity, made the young, ridiculously strong Jim an offer. There was an Anvil toss competition at the Calgary Stampede, the giant rodeo and festival the city is famous for. Stu promised Jim $500 if he would enter and win it. Jim, who had been throwing the shot put farther than anyone in California, looked at an anvil and figured he could handle it. He entered. He threw the anvil 11 feet and 2 inches, and he won. From that day forward, the man who had previously gone by the nickname The Animal became Jim the Anvil, a name forged, literally, from a feat of strength. In Stampede, he would also become a 2-time international tag team champion, holding the titles with Hercules Ayala and later with Mr. Hito, learning his craft in the territory before the bigger world came calling. And the bigger world did come calling. In the mid-1980s, the wrestling business was changing. Vince McMahon was taking his company national, turning regional wrestling into a coast-to-coast cultural phenomenon. He was hoovering up the best talent from territories all over North America, and he wanted Jim. Jim debuted for the World Wrestling Federation in early 1985, initially on his own. But fate, and a good idea, had something better in store. Bret Hart, Jim's brother-in-law, was also in the company at the time, stuck with a cowboy gimmick that was going nowhere. The story goes that Bret, frustrated and looking for a new direction, suggested to management that he and Jim be paired together as a team. The two men knew each other inside and out. They were family. They had a chemistry that could not be manufactured. And so, the Hart Foundation was born. Two brothers-in-law, managed by the loud, megaphone-wielding manager Jimmy Hart, who, despite sharing the name, was no relation. It was one of the great accidents of wrestling history, the kind of pairing that should not have worked as well as it did, and instead became legendary. The dynamic was perfect. Bret Hart was the technician, the artist, the cool and calculating ring general who would one day be regarded as one of the greatest in-ring performers of all time. And Jim was the engine, the power, the chaos. He brought the muscle and the menace, but he also brought something Bret openly admitted he lacked in those early days: personality. Bret has said many times over the years that Jim helped him come out of his shell, that Jim helped him find his own character. Jim's wild energy, that unmistakable cackling laugh, his motor-mouthed intensity, all of it gave the team a spark that pure athleticism never could have. They were not just a great wrestling team, they were great television. And Jim looked the part in a way few men ever have. He was built like a fire hydrant given legs, thick and powerful, with a barrel chest and a neck that seemed to disappear into his shoulders. He shaved his head and grew out that pointed goatee, and the result was a face that looked permanently caught somewhere between a grin and a threat. When he flexed and bugged out his eyes and let loose that high, braying laugh, he was instantly readable to anyone watching, the bully who actually enjoyed his work. In the ring, his role in the team was to be the wrecking ball, the one who could throw an opponent across the ring or anchor a double-team move with raw force, setting the table for Bret to come in and finish the picture. It was a division of labor as old as tag team wrestling itself, the brain and the brawn, and few teams ever balanced it as well as they did. The crowd loved to hate him, which in wrestling is the highest compliment a villain can earn, and he drew that heat night after night, town after town, for years. the Hart Foundation climbed fast. They turned themselves into one of the most hated villain teams in the company, and on the path to the top, they did something that wrestling fans still talk about. In early 1987, they captured the WWF World Tag Team Championship. The way they did it was pure pro wrestling theater. They beat the British Bulldogs, fellow Stampede graduates, with the help of a crooked referee named Danny Davis, who was conveniently distracted at all the right moments. It was a heel masterpiece, the kind of finish designed to make audiences furious, and it worked. The Hart Foundation were champions. They would lose the belts later that year, but they had arrived as a top act, and they would win the titles a second time, cementing their status as one of the defining tag teams of the entire decade. For years, Jim was a fixture at the top of the card. He main evented major events for the company, including Survivor Series in 1989. He and Bret feuded with every great team of the era: the Rougeau brothers, Demolition, the Rockers, the Legion of Doom. The Hart Foundation matches were a clinic in how to make tag team wrestling exciting, and Jim was an essential ingredient in every one of them. Now, here is where we have to be honest, because his daughter is honest about it, and so are the people who watched closely. There has always been a school of thought that says Jim was the weak link, that he was the lesser talent, carried to greatness by a brilliant partner. That in a team with one of the best wrestlers who ever lived, the Anvil was just along for the ride. And it is true that as a pure in-ring technician, Jim was never going to be confused with Bret Hart. Almost nobody was. But that take has always missed the point entirely. What Jim brought could not be measured by counting wrestling holds. He brought presence. He brought believability. He made the team feel dangerous in a way that Bret alone could not. The chemistry that made the Hart Foundation iconic only existed because both men were exactly who they were. Take Jim out, and you do not have a slightly worse version of the same team. You have a completely different and lesser thing. Eventually, all great teams come to an end. By the early 1990s, Bret Hart was being groomed for singles superstardom, and the original Hart Foundation split so that the Hitman could chase that destiny. Jim's career became more of a journeyman's path. He teamed with Bret's younger brother Owen. He drifted in and out of the company. But he had one more great chapter left in him. In 1997, the Hart Foundation was reborn, this time as a five-man faction. Bret Hart, Owen Hart, the British Bulldog Davey Boy Smith, the brilliant and troubled Brian Pillman, and Jim. The angle was electric. Bret Hart positioned himself as a proud Canadian hero who looked down on what he saw as a crude, declining American culture, and audiences in the United States despised him for it, while Canadian crowds treated him like a national treasure. The high point came at an event in Calgary in the summer of 1997, in front of a rabid hometown crowd, in a 10-man tag team match widely remembered as one of the best of its kind ever produced. Jim was right there in the middle of it, in his home away from home, part of one last truly great moment. It did not last. That same year, the wrestling world was rocked by the infamous incident in Montreal, where Bret Hart was double-crossed in his final match before leaving for the rival company. The fallout scattered the Hart Foundation. Bret left. Jim followed him out the door not long after. On his way out, he was humiliated in storyline fashion, a sad and disrespectful end to a long run with the company that had made him famous. He spent a brief, forgettable period with the other major promotion, teaming again with the British Bulldog, before quietly fading from the national spotlight by the end of 1998. And this is where the story gets harder. Because for a lot of wrestlers of that generation, leaving the bright lights was when the real trouble began. The wrestling business that Jim came up in was merciless on the human body. There was no off-season. The schedule was relentless. Hundreds of nights a year on the road, town to town, taking bumps on canvas stretched over wood and steel. And there was a culture, an unwritten understanding, about how you dealt with the constant pain that this lifestyle produced. You medicated. You took something to get through the night, something to sleep, something to manage injuries that never fully healed because you never stopped long enough to let them. An enormous number of performers from that era ended up dependent on various substances, and many of them did not make it out alive. The list of wrestlers from Jim's generation who died young is long and devastating. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it is not a coincidence. And it is not just a string of individual bad choices. It is a pattern. And patterns point to a system. The men who built the modern wrestling business in the 1980s and 1990s were treated in many ways as disposable. They were classified in a manner that left them without the safety nets that workers in most other industries take for granted, on the road for the overwhelming majority of the year, performing through injuries that would have sidelined an athlete in any mainstream sport. There was no real medical infrastructure designed to protect them long-term. No one tracking the cumulative damage. No system asking what all of this was doing to their bodies and their minds over a span of decades. When the cheering stopped and the bookings dried up, a lot of these men were simply left to manage the wreckage on their own, with whatever they could get their hands on. Jim was one of thousands of performers who came up inside that machine, and his later struggles cannot be honestly separated from the conditions of the work that made him famous in the first place. Jim struggled in this area too, and it became public in painful ways. In September of 2010, he was arrested near Tampa, Florida, after an incident at a gas station. According to reports at the time, police were called, and when they searched him, they found a significant quantity of controlled substances. He faced multiple charges, including possession, and he was ultimately sentenced to a period of incarceration. It was the kind of news story that gets passed around with a sneer, another faded star fallen on hard times, another cautionary tale. But it is worth pausing here, because the way we talk about these stories matters. It is very easy to look at an arrest like that and reduce a man to it, to file him away as just an addict, just a problem, just a washed-up wrestler who could not get his life together. And that framing, his own daughter would later argue, completely misunderstood what was actually happening to him. Because we now have reason to believe that the substance struggles, the erratic behavior, the financial trouble, the moments where he simply did not seem like himself were not the whole story. They may have been symptoms. Symptoms of something growing inside his head that nobody could see, and that he could not control. This is the part of Jim's life that the world only began to understand near the very end, and in many ways only after he was gone. Somewhere in his later years, Jim began to change. The sharp, funny, quick-witted man that everyone in the business knew started to slip. At first, it would have been easy to miss or to explain away. Forgetfulness, confusion, behavior that did not quite add up. His family began to notice things that worried them deeply. In one heartbreaking example that was later shared publicly, he started buying the same pair of shoes over and over again, apparently with no memory that he already owned them, until it had quietly run up thousands of dollars in debt. These are not the actions of a careless man. They are the actions of a brain that is no longer holding on to information the way it used to. The family eventually received a diagnosis, and at the time, they understood it to be Alzheimer's disease, or an Alzheimer's-like condition. There was even a family history that seemed to support it, because Jim's own mother had suffered from Alzheimer's. It seemed to fit, and so the family made a profound and loving decision. They chose not to tell Jim the full extent of what was happening to him. They held the diagnosis back, deliberately, so that he could enjoy whatever time he had left without the crushing weight of knowing exactly what was coming. They wanted him to be able to laugh, to be himself, to spend his days as the Anvil and not as a patient. It is the kind of decision there is no clean right answer to, the kind of decision a family makes out of pure love and then lives with forever. Some of this played out, with the family's permission, on the reality television show that Jim's daughter appeared on, the one that gave him a late career resurgence in popularity. Longtime viewers could see it for themselves, even if they could not name it. The man on screen still looked like the Anvil. The goatee was still there, but something was off. He seemed heavier, more out of breath, his face flushed, and more troublingly, the lightning-fast wit was gone. He was present, but at times he seemed to be somewhere else, just slightly behind the conversation. The audience watched a legend fade in real time, and most of them had no idea what they were really seeing. It is important to be careful and honest here about what we know and what we do not. The picture of Jim's decline that emerged in his final years and in the years since does not come from a single tidy medical report. It comes from a combination of his family's accounts, the diagnosis they understood at the time, and reflections that came later. The reality show by its nature compressed and arranged events for television, so the way it presented his decline and his death should not be treated as a precise medical timeline. What is not in dispute is that the man was clearly, visibly, painfully declining, and that those closest to him were watching it happen and trying to protect him from it. And here is where the deepest truth of his story comes into focus, a truth that his daughter Natalia has only recently felt able to speak about openly. In the years after his death, as she revisited everything, she came to believe that the explanation the family had accepted, Alzheimer's, did not fully capture what had taken her father. She has spoken about how he had lived with a brain injury for most of his life, going all the way back to those childhood football days with no helmets, through the NFL, and through decades of taking blows to the head as a professional wrestler. How many times, she has asked, can a man's head absorb that kind of punishment before it changes him? She has described his condition using a term that has become tragically familiar in the world of contact sports: chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, the degenerative brain disease caused by repeated head trauma, the same condition that has devastated so many football players and so many wrestlers, the condition that can mimic dementia, that can cause mood changes and confusion and erratic behavior, and that has been linked to so much of the suffering in the violent professions Jim spent his life in. Now, in the interest of accuracy, this point deserves a careful note. CTE is a disease that, with current medicine, can only be definitively diagnosed by examining the brain after death. So when his daughter speaks about her father's CTE, she is speaking as a family member who lived through his decline and who has come to understand it through that lens, drawing a line from a lifetime of head trauma to the symptoms she watched destroy him. Whether the public record contains a formal post-mortem confirmation is not something that should be overstated. But what she is describing fits a pattern that the wrestling and football worlds have been forced to confront again and again. A big, tough man, defined by his physical durability, whose mind quietly comes apart decades after the hits stop. And if she is right, then the substance struggles, the arrest, the strange behavior, the moments that the world judged him for look very different. They look less like the failings of a weak man and more like the early warning signs of a brain that had been injured over and over for more than half a century. That reframing is everything. It takes a story that the world had filed away as a sad decline and turns it into something more like a slow tragedy that began on a youth football field in the 1960s and did not finish until a Florida bedroom in 2018. Which brings us finally to the end. To those last days. There is a detail about the weekend before Jim died that is almost unbearably poignant, and it gives those final hours a meaning his family has held on to ever since. In the days leading up to his death, Jim had a visitor. His sister came to spend time with him, and she brought with her pieces of their shared past. Old items, old videos, footage and mementos from when they were young, and the family gathered together and did the simplest, most beautiful thing imaginable. They sat and they reminisced. They looked back over the long, wild, remarkable arc of Jim's life. The shot put record, the Anvil toss, the Hart family, the championships, the laughter. His daughter has described what that weekend felt like in hindsight, and her words are haunting. She has said that it was almost as if her father spent that time watching a highlight reel of his own life, saying goodbye to all of them without ever realizing that he was saying goodbye. None of them knew it was the end. There was no sense of finality in the room, no deathbed, no last words spoken with the weight of being last words. There was just a family together, going through old pictures and old videos, enjoying each other's company the way families do. And then it was over. Consider also how unpredictable the disease that was killing him could be. Just months earlier, in the spring of that same year, his old manager Jimmy Hart had seen him at a major wrestling weekend, and by Jimmy's account, Jim had seemed wonderful, witty, funny, sharp as a tack, in his words. That is the merciless nature of what Jim was living with. To some people, on some days, he could still be entirely himself. To the people who lived with him, the decline was undeniable. The man could seem perfectly fine to an old friend in April and be slipping away by the summer. There was no steady, predictable slope. There was only the disease, doing its work in the dark. Then came Monday, August 13th, 2018. It was early. Emergency services in Pasco County, Florida, received a call sometime around 6:30 in the morning. The report was of a man having seizures and convulsions. The address was the home Jim shared with his wife, Ellie. By the time help could matter, it was already too late. The most direct account of what happened came later from family members. Jim had gotten up that morning. He went to lower the temperature on the air conditioner, and he simply collapsed. A grand mal seizure, the kind that takes away consciousness and seizes control of the whole body, struck him down. As he fell, he hit his head. The official word from the sheriff's office was straightforward and final. He had fallen at home, hit his head, and succumbed to his injury. No foul play was suspected. One brother-in-law, reflecting on it afterward, said gently that Jim had collapsed and died pretty quickly, and that he believed the whole thing had stemmed from the illness Jim had been battling for so long. There is a strange and difficult mercy buried in that. After everything, the brain disease did not draw out his final scene over years of total deterioration in a care facility, the way it does to so many. It took him fast, on an ordinary morning, in his own home, before the worst stages of the decline could fully arrive. His daughter has said she found a measure of peace in the fact that her father was still, in the ways that mattered, himself at the very end. He had not been reduced to a stranger. He had been there that final weekend, surrounded by family, laughing at old videos. And then he was gone. For Natalia, the news arrived by phone. The call came in the early morning hours, around 7. Her sister was on the other end of the line, and she did not soften it, because how could you soften something like that? The words were simple and devastating. Their father had died. Natalia has spoken about that moment, about how unreal it felt, how she had genuinely believed her father would live forever, how she had always seen him as an unbreakable, unstoppable force. That word again, unbreakable. The anvil, the block of iron. And now the unbreakable man was gone, taken not by any opponent or any accident in the ring, but by the slow accumulation of a lifetime of hits that the world had cheered for. The shock was real even though, on some level, the family had known this day would come. That is one of the strange cruelties of losing someone to a long illness. You spend so much energy preparing for the future, for the slow road ahead, that you are somehow never prepared for the sudden stop. They had braced for years of caregiving. They had not braced for an ordinary Monday. What happened next is part of what makes Jim's story land the way it does. Because the timing was almost impossibly tight. His death came just days before one of the biggest events on the wrestling calendar, an event his daughter was scheduled to be a part of. And Natalia, in the middle of her grief, in the middle of frantically helping to plan her father's funeral, made the choice to go out and perform. When she walked to the ring at that event, only days after losing him, she did not go out as just herself. She wore her father's jacket, his old leather jacket, a piece of him, carried back into the spotlight he had loved so much. It was a tribute, an act of love, and a daughter carrying her father with her into the very world he had given his body and his mind to. The funeral itself became a celebration of everything he had been. The family put together a display of his life, a long table covered with photographs and keepsakes that traced the whole journey. And standing over it, his wife Ellie summed it up as simply as anyone could, saying that everything he was about, his family and his dreams and all of it, was right there on that table. Among the items were his famous sunglasses and that signature leather jacket, and in a detail that stops you cold, a tiny pair of baby shoes, a reminder of just how fast an entire life can pass from those first steps to the last. There was also his personal rosary, and it was given to Natalia because it had been his wish that it passed to the daughter who had followed him into the ring and carried the family name back into the spotlight. She set his shades above his jacket and wept, and told everyone gathered there how much she had loved her dad. It was, by every account, exactly the send-off he deserved, assembled in the middle of unimaginable grief by a family that was determined to honor him properly, to make sure the last public memory of Jim was not of a man undone by illness, but of a life that had been enormous and loud and full. And then, in the months that followed, something happened that turns this story into exactly the kind of bittersweet vindication that the wrestling world has seen too many times. Jim had, by various accounts, been frustrated during his life that he had never received what he felt was his due from the industry. He had not been inducted into the company's Hall of Fame, and his daughter has said it genuinely bothered him. He felt he had earned that honor, and watching others go in ahead of him stung. He wanted it while he was alive, while he could stand on that stage, while it could mean something to him in the moment. He did not get it in time. He died in August of 2018. And the following year, in 2019, the company announced that the Hart Foundation, Bret Hart and Jim the Anvil, would finally be inducted into the Hall of Fame. The recognition he had wanted for so long arrived just months after he was no longer around to receive it. His partner Bret spoke of how emotional it was, of how he had hoped for years that the two of them would get to stand on that stage together as a team, and how that was never going to happen now. His daughter has revealed that she was even given the option to have her father inducted on his own, as a solo star, and that she chose instead to have him go in as part of the Hart Foundation, alongside Bret, because that team was the time he had loved most. The era when, in her words, he was the most alive and did his best work. So the honor came, and it came in exactly the form that would have meant the most to him, and it came too late for him to feel it. That is wrestling. That is so often how this business tells its survivors that they mattered, only after they are gone. So what do we make of the final 48 hours of Jim, and of the life that led up to them? The temptation, looking at a story like this, is to make it a cautionary tale, or a tragedy, and to leave it there. And there is real tragedy in it, no question. A man who started taking hits to the head as an 11-year-old, who threw himself into football and the NFL, and then into decades of professional wrestling, and who paid for all of it with his mind. A man whose late life struggles were judged harshly by people who did not understand that those struggles may have been the symptoms of an injury, not the proof of a character flaw. A man who got the recognition he craved only after he could no longer enjoy it. But there is something else in there too, and it would be a disservice to him to miss it. Because the last real moments of Jim's life were not bleak. They were warm. They were a weekend spent with family, laughing over old videos, surrounded by the people who loved him most, before a sudden end that spared him the worst of what was coming. He was still himself. He was still the Anvil. And the world he had helped build did not forget him. His daughter carried his jacket into the ring. His partner spoke his name into a Hall of Fame microphone. An entire generation of fans who had grown up imitating that cackling laugh mourned him as one of their own. And maybe the most important thing his story has done is force a conversation. Because Jim was not the first wrestler or the first football player to be quietly taken apart by repeated trauma to the head, and he will not be the last. But every time a family like his chooses to speak openly about it, the way his daughter has, the harder it becomes for these industries to look away. The harder it becomes to dismiss a struggling former star as just a problem, instead of asking what those hits really cost him. The harder it becomes to keep treating the brain as the one part of a tough man that does not need protecting. The man they named after an anvil turned out to be more fragile than anyone ever imagined, in the one place no one was looking. And there is a lesson in that, about toughness, and about the hidden bill that always, eventually, comes due. Jim the Anvil spent his whole life convincing the world he was unbreakable. The heartbreaking truth is that he had been breaking, slowly and silently, for most of it. And he and his family paid that price in private, behind a closed door, while the rest of us were still cheering. There is one more thing worth saying, and it is maybe the kindest way to hold all of this. The version of Jim that the world will remember, the one frozen in those old highlight packages, is not a tragic figure at all. He is a man at the absolute height of his powers, strutting and laughing and flexing, surrounded by a family that loved him, doing the thing he was put on this earth to do in front of crowds who could not get enough of him. That man was real. The decline was also real, and it should not be hidden or sanitized, because hiding it is part of how these things keep happening. But the decline did not erase the joy that came before it, and it did not erase the man himself. Both things are true at once. He was a powerhouse and a showman and a devoted family man who lit up a room, and he was also a casualty of a lifetime of impacts that nobody, including him, fully understood until it was far too late. To remember only the tragedy would be to let it swallow everything good about him. To remember only the glory would be to learn nothing from how it ended. The honest thing, the thing his family has tried to do, is to hold both in the same hand and refuse to look away from either. He was 63 years old. He was a husband, a father of 3 daughters, a brother-in-law to a wrestling dynasty, and one of the most beloved characters of his era. He was the kid who threw the shot put farther than anyone in California. The man who tossed an anvil for $500 and walked away with a name that would outlive him. The laughing, larger-than-life presence who helped turn tag team wrestling into something close to an art form. He gave the business everything he had, his body and, in the end, his mind itself. And on an ordinary Monday morning in Florida, reaching for an air conditioner, the anvil finally went quiet. If this story moved you, take a moment to remember him not just for the laugh and the muscles and the championships, but for everything underneath all of that. Like and subscribe for more hard-hitting wrestling documentaries. Until next time.